trip director something around 2 o'clock in the morning and told that he had lost his great friend, Ted Kennedy. There you have the, from back to forth in the first and second pews, last two Democrats to occupy the next office. And Michael Bishop's like these days.
Between Barack Obama and Bill Clinton. Well, needless to say, Bill Clinton is going to make a very great effort to make sure that the relationship is pretty good, because his wife is the President's Secretary of State. We haven't seen that before in history. But it is a relationship that's a little bit fraught. In 1996, when Bill Clinton was running for re-election, Barack Obama was quoted in Chicago as saying, "I like Clinton's political skills, but not particularly his policies," and that's a difference that really has remained up to the present.
We see more vehicles arriving out front. Andrea Mitchell.
And in fact, now they've had their first quiet meetings, one-on-one,
post-Korea,
in the Oval Office because of Korea, because of the trip to North Korea. First in the Situation Room, but then a long private session in the Oval Office. And I think that that is the beginning of real repair in the relationship. Barack Obama turning to Bill Clinton for his expertise, his insights into the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-il, and I'm told they talked well beyond that. But it's interesting that, as Michael points out, in 1996, when Bill Clinton was running for re-election, people like Barack Obama in Chicago and elsewhere in the country, and some in President Clinton's own cabinet, were very distressed by the welfare reform legislation. Those compromises, moving to the center, that's what offended Jimmy Carter and others, Donna Shalala in the cabinet, and Barack Obama was far more liberal in his policies than he has evolved to be over the years as he had to win the presidency.
And it really shows that with Barack Obama's election, the Ted Kennedy wing of the Democratic Party has prevailed over the Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton wing, which was, the idea was to be centrist and try to make the Democratic Party a little bit more electable. Kennedy, over the last 47 years, and Barack Obama last year, said essentially, we're going to go back to the essence of what the Democratic Party has been.
Just the front section of political dignitaries. You noticed on the high shot earlier, there is a section as you look down the center aisle of the church on the right-hand side that is reserved just for the Kennedy family. They'll be coming in shortly as Cardinal O'Malley now works his way through the front section, thanking the various political dignitaries for attending. Andrea, when you try to count up the number of Kennedy family, extended Kennedy family, you have to include members of the Reggie extended political family that stretches deep in the South into Louisiana, cousins and grandchildren, and it's quite something.
And it was in a dinner party at Judge Edward Reggie's house that Vicki met Teddy Kennedy during a very difficult period in his life. There's no glossing that. And there was an immediate connection. They had known each other years earlier, you know, just through families. This was a storied Louisiana political family, not quite like the Kennedys, but it had some of those particulars, and deeply Catholic faith, and she has really helped in what is widely acknowledged by friends and adversaries to be the transformation of Edward M. Kennedy. The love of his life, everyone acknowledges that. She was deeply involved in preserving this past 15 months, the quality of his life after they rigorously examined the care options and knew what the diagnosis would be, but preserving and prolonging his life. He wanted to see Barack Obama elected president. He wanted to be on the steps of the Capitol on Inauguration Day. We saw what happened at the lunch when it was too much for him and he ended up in the hospital. But she managed all of that, and then when it was clear that there were no further options, brought him home to Hyannisport so he could sail, be with the dogs, be with the children and grandchildren, and really regulated who got to see him and say farewell. And there were some who wanted to get in and didn't, but she knew exactly what he wanted, and she has been an extraordinary presence in his life. And you see the inclusiveness of the family with Joan, his first wife, and the mother of his children, and the closeness there included in everything, as they would be. This is an enormous family. More than 60 grandnieces and grandnephews, as you've described, 28 nieces and nephews, and nothing could have been more moving last night than Joe Kennedy talking about thanking Reggie and Ted Kennedy's children, Curran and Caroline Racklin, whom he considered his children and went to every soccer game, and this extended blended family. But thanking them for sharing their father with all of the cousins who so desperately needed a figure, a patriarch, a father figure to lean on after they had lost theirs.
As he put it, to hang on to. And, you know, Michael, we just saw a glimpse of the mass card that attendants received today. Starting in Hyannisport on Wednesday, you and I have been talking about something you already mentioned today, and that is of the brothers, the only non-violent death. More than that, he managed this. He mapped it out along with Vicky, and by all accounts, got as much enjoyment out of life in these last few months as he possibly could have.
Yeah, and you can really look at the last few days almost as a Ted Kennedy self-portrait, because since he planned all this, he was able to convey the essence of who he was. And you know, that thing last night, all the funny stories and the warmth, that's something that really is of this period and very much characteristic of him. You know, think of the contrast between, under very different circumstances, the ceremonies for John and Robert Kennedy.
These buses now arriving, part of the huge numbers brought over from the library, and then, of course, the body of Senator Kennedy will enter. John McCain, Frank Lautenberg there. You see Senator Rockefeller. You see Senator Hatch, his head down, reading, and then the discussion continues between Secretary of State and former president, between former president and current president. The Bidens there in the front row, sitting next to Mrs. Obama, who's having a conversation with Mrs. Bush.
I'm also struck by something our friend and colleague Mike Barnacle shared earlier today, that in recent days, final days, in talking to Teddy Kennedy, how the late senator talked about his belief in redemption and resurrection, and his faith was so much a part of him, and that isn't easily apparent to those who didn't know him well. But this Catholic funeral mass is all part of that as well, and he profoundly believed he was going to be reunited with his brothers. I was also struck, Michael, when Michael mentioned the tragic and sudden deaths of his brothers. Also Kathleen Kennedy, his sister, and Joe Kennedy. Brian Hart, the father of that Iraq soldier who found that Ted Kennedy helped in up-armoring the Humvees, described how Ted Kennedy said to him that they were a Gold Star family. He remembers where his mother Rose was when she heard the news that Joe had died in World War II. You forget, because he was so ebullient and youthful, that he was part of that generation, and as a child, as the youngest Kennedy, remembered very well losing his brother.
His hero as a young man, and Joe, of course, took on a high-risk experimental military mission. Michael Beschloss, here we're watching members of the extended family come in, and if you grew up here in the East Coast, you know that ubiquitous Peter Pan bus lines logo. Of course, they'd have nothing else on a day like today.
Absolutely, that's part of the show too, I think. But you're right, and you know, talking about this family, it's now the fourth generation after old Joe Kennedy. And in the 1930s, when Joe Kennedy set out to create this dynasty, he wanted to make sure that they all stuck together. And the amazing thing, given the realities of America in 2009, is that the members of this fourth generation, they love each other, they like to get together, and for the most part, they are very close. It shows that that family ethic really has prevailed. But you know, one more thing, you know, based on what you were saying, Brian, as long as Ted Kennedy was alive, you know, you knew that he was the brother of Jack, and you knew that he had been in all those sessions, you know, and experiences with Bobby, and that he had met Franklin Roosevelt and all these people all the way up to the present. And now that he's gone, that all seems a little bit more distant and a little bit more closed. Sort of interesting in terms of history.
A bunch of the combined children here of